Good afternoon. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Security Technologies will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to examine the evolving cybersecurity threats from nation-states such as China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, as well as cyber threats from criminal organizations and terrorist groups such as ISIS. Over the last several years, we've seen these actors continue to develop and even build more sophisticated cyber capabilities. In 2016, these hackers pose an even greater threat to the U.S. homeland and our critical infrastructure. To put it simply, cybersecurity is national security. In 2015, the nation was victim to one of the most significant cyber attacks in our history. The breach at the Office of Personnel Management exposed the personal and extremely sensitive security clearance information of 21.5 million current and former government employees. In 2014, we saw North Korea conduct a cyber attack on Sony Pictures that not only destroyed computers, but also sought to muzzle free speech and threaten American ideals. Unfortunately, the administration's lack of proportional responses to these cyber attacks has demonstrated to the world that there are no real consequences for such actions. Without a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy that addresses deterrence effectively, I worry that 2016 could bring an increasing number of those willing to push the boundaries. In recent news, a lot of attention was directed at the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center in Los Angeles that was the victim of a ransomware attack. This type of malware infects victims' computers and locks them until a payment or a ransom is made. The medical center was forced to pay $17,000 to restore its systems. But this isn't a problem unique to Hollywood. In my own district in Northeast Texas, the Titus Regional Medical Center suffered a similar attack. Their electronic health record system was locked, and they weren't able to access patient information. Of the nation-states, Russia continues to rank near the top in terms of capabilities, with increasing aggression across the globe that may continue to manifest itself in cyberspace. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in September that the Russian government is establishing its own Central Cyber Command that will be responsible for carrying out offensive cyber operations. China also ranks high in terms of capability, and it continues to pose a significant threat to the U.S. in terms of cyber espionage and the theft of intellectual property. In September, the administration announced an agreement with the Chinese government to refrain from engaging in hacking of our intellectual property. I look forward to hearing today from our industry witnesses on their thoughts about the success of this agreement. Iran continues to emerge as a top cybersecurity threat as well. While many would argue that its intent to carry out its attacks is strong, it still lags behind other nation-states in terms of capabilities. However, the administration's recent nuclear agreement with Iran could have unintended consequences in cyberspace, as the lifting of economic sanctions could provide the influx of cash to fuel the development of cybersecurity capabilities. Criminal organizations continue to pose a great risk to the American people, as we've seen with breaches at places like Target and Home Depot, which exposed the credit card information of millions of people. While the intent of criminal groups may be different from nation-states, the impact on everyday Americans is felt very directly. Lastly, terrorist groups such as ISIS may currently lack the capability to pose a major cybersecurity threat to the United States, but given the vast resources this group has amassed, developing or purchasing sophisticated cyber tools is not far out of reach. ISIS followers and the so-called cyber caliphate have had success in hacking social media accounts of our military personnel and posting home addresses and other personal information online, asking followers to carry out attacks. In late 2015, Congress, recognizing these threats, enacted the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. The Act establishes the Department of Homeland Security National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, or NCIC, as the sole civilian interface for sharing cyber threat information with the federal government. The Act establishes liability protections for companies to share information with DHS and among themselves. In light of this legislation, we hope that the private sector will share more with each other and with the government, and we look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on what they're doing to increase information sharing. In response to the devastating attack on OPM, the Act bolsters DHS's ability to deploy intrusion detection and prevention capabilities across our federal government. These capabilities will ensure the proper capabilities to defend government networks from nation-state attacks. Unfortunately, cyber threat actors, be they nation-states, criminal groups, or terrorist organizations, remain undeterred, continuing to conduct cyber attacks. The problem is compounded by the lack of acceptable norms in cyberspace, and I have questions on whether or not the administration's lack of response to these attacks has deterred or even emboldened our adversaries. The President recently announced a cybersecurity national action plan. Whether this is too little too late and the clarity of the overall guidance behind the plan remain to be seen as we watch for the most meaningful part of any grand plan, its execution. In this day and age, there is agreement that the battle for security of our information systems is continually escalating. The testimony today will help inform what actions Congress can take to further the interests of our national security. The Chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today on information security threats and how we manage cyber threat intelligence, areas that are central to our subcommittee's oversight responsibilities. I also want to thank our witnesses for their participation in today's hearing, and especially welcome Dr. Porsche from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for being with us today. The Department of Homeland Security plays a fundamental role in the national effort to increase our collective cybersecurity. But it cannot achieve its mission without a foundation of voluntary partnerships with the critical infrastructure community. The information security industry and our government are partners. The privately owned critical infrastructures that are everywhere in my district, including ports, energy and pipeline networks, chemical manufacturers, and refineries, ship and supply goods and raw materials to all parts of our country and are vital to the jobs and economic well-being of my part of the world. When the cyber information security and network systems fail for these kind of sites, whether from a natural disaster or a man-made intrusion, everyone feels it. It is in the national interest to safeguard such critical infrastructure and to make sure that there are adequate protections from cyber and information and data interruptions. This subcommittee has oversight responsibilities for the Department's U.S. CERT and ICS CERT teams that provide the foundation of the U.S. government's approach to securing and safeguarding the resilience of civilian cyber and critical infrastructure essential services. It will be necessary for this subcommittee to continue to do all we can to help DHS develop a workable national cyber protection strategy and framework for critical infrastructure entities and small and large businesses in order to protect our economy. After this subcommittee and full committee passed important information sharing legislation last year, the legislation found its way to the President's desk where he signed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, or CISA, on December 18th of 2015. Today, I hope to hear from our witnesses how the Department is doing with its new information sharing authorities and challenges, and how cyber and information security industries are expanding their collaboration with the Department as a result of that legislation. It will be important to know how cybersecurity companies can continue to collaborate with the Department to help U.S. CERT and ICS CERT serve as the center of our national integration, information sharing, and collaborative analysis for domestic and global cyber threat intelligence. Finally, I hope to find out from our witnesses how we can help further the ability of DHS's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, or NCIC, to receive and analyze information at machine speed. an essential component of getting a leg up on the ever-changing landscape and worldwide cyber threat intelligence. So I look forward to today's hearing, and Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. Joining us, our witnesses, our first witness is Mr. Frank Salufo, who is the Associate Vice President and Director of the George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Welcome, Mr. Salufo. Also with us is Ms. Jennifer Coldy. She is the Lead Technical Director for FireEye Threat Intelligence. Thanks for being here today. Mr. Adam Bromwich is the Vice President for Security Technology and Response at Symantec and is also representing the Cyber Threat Alliance. Welcome, Mr. Bromwich. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Isaac Porch, did I say that correctly? Is the Associate Director of the Forces and Logistics Program within the Army Research Division of the RAND Corporation. Welcome, Doctor. I would now ask the witnesses all to stand and raise your right hand, and I will swear you in to give your testimony. Do each of you swear that the testimony that you will give today shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Salufo for his opening statement.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, Congressman Marino, and Donovan, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Mr. Chairman, I think you did an amazing job framing the issues here, so I'll try to be even more brief, which is not my strong suit, since I've never had an unspoken thought, but I'll try to hit on a couple points that weren't addressed. I mean, obviously today the U.S. faces a dizzying array of cyber threats from many and varied actors. Virtually every day there's a new incident in the headlines, and the initiative clearly remains with the attacker. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, last week it was Hollywood Presbyterian. Also last week there was some news of a manipulation, a Russian hack that took place about a year ago, where they were able to manipulate the US dollar and ruble exchange rate. And even more disconcerting was the December 2015 cyber attack on Ukraine's electric grid, which affected 4 dozen substations and left 250,000 people without power. At the same time as the attack on the grid itself, call centers were hit with the telephony denial of service attack as customers were trying to report the outages. So if anyone thought this was a glitch, think again. U.S. critical infrastructure, notably lifeline sectors such as energy and electricity, telecommunications, transportation, water, and financial services, from banks to exchanges and clearinghouses, are in the crosshairs and are primary targets for cyber attacks and cyber crimes. Our national security, public safety, economic competitiveness, and personal privacy are at risk. The threat tempo is magnified by the speed at which technologies continue to evolve and by the fact that our adversaries continue to adapt their tactics, techniques, and procedures in order to evade and defeat the latest prevention and response measures. While breaches to date have largely exemplified data theft and destruction, a concerning trend looking ahead will be data manipulation. A few words on the threat itself, and I hope there'll be some time during Q&A to expand. Firstly, not all hacks are the same, nor are all hackers the same. The threat comes in various shapes, sizes, and forms, ranging from nation-states at the high end of the threat spectrum to foreign terrorist organizations, criminal enterprises, and hacktivists. Just as diverse as the threat actors themselves are the intentions, capabilities, and TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, and the tools they ultimately utilize. Put another way, nearly every form of conflict today and tomorrow will have a cyber dimension to it. Whereas technologies will continue to evolve and change, human nature remains pretty consistent. If it happens in the physical world, it's happening in the cyber world. And increasingly, you're seeing those two worlds converge, especially with the advent of the Internet of Things and Internet of Everything. A couple of quick top-line words on the threat actors. As I just mentioned, nation states and their proxies continue to present the greatest and most advanced and persistent threat in the cyber domain. And my testimony will focus on 4 key actors, all of which, Mr. Chairman, you identified. But it's important to keep in mind the broader context. Every country that has a modern military and intelligence service also has a computer network attack capability. Topping the list are countries that are integrating computer network attack and computer network exploit into their warfighting strategy and doctrine. The most sophisticated actors are obviously Russia and China. Nation states often use proxies to conceal their involvement. In turn, there are different grades of proxies. They may be state-sanctioned, state-sponsored, or state-supported. While improvements have been made in terms of attribution, we're by no means at the place where we hope and need to be. Both China and Russia are known to use proxies to do their bidding, largely to provide plausible deniability. After these 2 countries come Iran and North Korea. While, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, they're not up to par with Russia and China in terms of their capability, they are investing very heavily in their computer network attack capabilities. And what they may lack in capability, unfortunately, they make up for in intent. Moreover, having fewer constraints, you're starting to see more concern that they'll turn to attack, not just espionage. And this is evidenced by the 2013 DDoS attacks on the U.S. banks, by the Sands Casino attack, by the Saudi Aramco and Qatari Rasgas attacks, just to name a few, and North Korea's attacks on South Korean banks, energy companies, and of course Sony. Next up are foreign terrorist organizations. They certainly possess the motivation and intent, but fortunately they do not have the same level of capability that nations do in terms of cyber means. But the recent doxing attacks and tactics used against U.S. military and law enforcement is troubling and indicative of an emerging threat. It is likely that ISIS or their sympathizers will increasingly turn to disruptive cyber attacks. What capabilities they don't possess, they can simply buy or rent, as cyber weapons are readily available and accessible in the deep web and darknet. Think cyber drive-by shootings. They may not have a sustained capability, but they can have a disruptive capability. By contrast, criminal organizations and criminal enterprises possess substantial capabilities, but obviously their motivation and intent differs from terrorists. They don't want to bring attention to their cause. They're in it for what? They're in it for money. So by and large, they're going to be the most quiet and subtle actors in the cyber domain. However, it is disconcerting when you look at some of the trends where criminal enterprises are working increasingly with nation states, notably Russia. In closing, while I recognize the focus of the hearing is on cyber threats, I do want to say a couple words on recommendations going forward. From the standpoint of critical infrastructure, a sustained campaign of cyber attacks hold the potential to undermine trust and confidence in the system itself, irrespective of the perpetrator. How many companies, even the largest, went into business thinking they were defending themselves against foreign intelligence services? That's precisely what's happening today. Companies taking on nations or being exploited by nations. We need to impose costs for bad cyber behavior on those who are currently acting with impunity. This demands articulating and, more importantly, demonstrating a cyber deterrent strategy. Secondly, cybercrime is the only crime I know of where we blame the victim. Yes, companies can and must do more to shore up their cybersecurity, but the current approach, or business as usual, is doomed for failure, as it is completely reactive. If you think about it, every time we get hit or breached, it's the equivalent of calling a locksmith, not a police officer, the locksmith. We can't simply react and continue to build higher walls or bigger locks. Moving forward, in connection with this last point, the U.S. government must give companies who now find themselves at the tip of the spear the framework, parameters, and tools that they need in order to engage in active defense to protect themselves and their customers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry for going a little over.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Salufo. Chair now recognizes Ms. Coldy for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our Ranking Member Richmond, Congressman Marino, Congressman Donovan, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. FireEye has a unique position within the security field. We have broad visibility across the threat landscape through a global network of over 10 million sensors. We have deep insight into threat actor activity through our Mandiant consulting and incident response practice. and we combine this visibility with contextual analysis and intelligence through FireEye Intelligence and our newly acquired EyeSight partners. I have personally spent nearly 20 years in the information security field in both the government and private sector, including nearly 10 years using threat intelligence to identify and track sophisticated threat groups. I would like to describe the changing threat landscape as we see it. FireEye currently tracks several hundred threat groups, including nation-state sponsored groups, cybercriminals, and terrorists. Across all of these groups, malicious activity continues to evolve more quickly than the ability of the private sector to safeguard assets, including financial data, personal health information, and intellectual property. We continue to see operations from nation-state actors. This includes increased activity from countries such as Russia, whose actions have become both more public and more aggressive, as well as from Iran and North Korea, who, while not as sophisticated, have shown a willingness to engage in destructive attacks. We also see operations from China-based groups, though it is premature to speculate whether or not this activity contravenes the recent agreements restricting commercial cyber espionage. At a minimum, we assess that China will continue to engage in cyber operations for the purpose of traditional espionage. We also see cybercrime continue unabated. This includes well-known activities such as identity theft, financial fraud, and theft of payment card data. However, cybercriminals are becoming more creative in their methods. Examples include hacking companies for insider business information in order to gain an advantage in the US stock market, and using extortion against corporations, whether that is ransomware used to encrypt corporate data or threatening to expose sensitive corporate information if the criminals are not paid. We have directly observed very little activity that we would ascribe to cyber terrorists, and their actions to date have largely been unsophisticated, such as defacements of websites and denial of service attacks. However, we assess that terrorist groups remain interested in cyber operations and recruiting individuals with advanced skills or insider access, and could potentially carry out an impactful attack using only unsophisticated tools. We also see an increase in the sophistication of the tools and techniques used by some of the nation-state and criminal groups that we monitor. This includes tools that can evade traditional operating system security and security software, or that reside only in computer memory and leave very few forensic traces. We also see increased efforts by the attackers to hide in plain sight so that hacker activity is indistinguishable from legitimate user behavior without using advanced detection methods. These trends are concerning. Threat groups of all types continue to believe that cyber operations offer an asymmetric advantage. That is, groups with otherwise limited resources can obtain high rewards with low risk. Challenges inherent to our ability to effectively investigate, analyze, attribute, and prosecute activity leads to the sense that these groups can operate with impunity. The challenges we face are many, and any solution to this complex problem must be multifaceted. I offer the following as essential, though not comprehensive, components to that solution. First, the public and private sectors must share information about malicious activity in a trusted, timely, and automated manner. However, the information shared cannot consist solely of technical indicators, but must be enhanced with contextual data that will allow defenders to prioritize alerts and respond faster and more effectively with appropriate countermeasures. Second, we must understand that it is infeasible to secure networks or assets to prevent all possible attacks. Organizations must understand that real risks and advanced attacks will occur. We must proactively hunt for malicious activity that may have breached our defenses, and we must be prepared to detect and respond to malicious activity across the entire attack lifecycle. Finally, we must continue to make it more difficult for attackers to reach their objectives. This should not be achieved by implementing compliance-type checklists, but through a risk-based approach where organizations identify critical assets and implement appropriate countermeasures based on a real-world understanding of how attackers operate. By improving our defenses and the ability to quickly detect malicious activity, we may slow down attackers to give defenders more time to respond, or better yet, deter some opportunistic attackers altogether. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Bromwich for 5 minutes.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Your focus on emerging threats is right on point because more than perhaps any other security discipline, cybersecurity is constantly evolving. Many of the recent headlines about cyber attacks have highlighted data breaches in government and across the spectrum of industries. But cyber attacks encompass more than just breaches. The incidents we see today range from basic confidence schemes to sophisticated and potentially destructive intrusions into critical infrastructure systems. The attackers run the gamut and include highly organized criminal enterprises, disgruntled employees, individual cybercriminals, so-called hacktivists, and state-sponsored groups. Common attack types range from distributed denial of service, or DDoS, to highly targeted attacks, to widely distributed financial fraud scams. A DDoS attack is an attempt to overwhelm a system with data, while targeted attacks typically try to trick someone into opening an infected file or clicking on a bad link. Of course, scams and blackmail schemes for profit continue. One of the most common is ransomware, which locks the victim's computer and displays a screen that purports to be from law enforcement. The attackers demand payment of a fine for having illegal content on the computer. But criminals are always looking for new ways to make money. They have moved beyond ransomware and are now frequently using a more insidious and harmful form of malware known as crypto lockers. While most scams are classic confidence schemes, ransom script is straight-up blackmail. Pay a ransom or your computer files will be lost. The criminals use high-grade encryption technology to scramble the victim's computer, and only the attacker has the key to unlock it. In the past month, Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in California fell victim to just this kind of attack. Over a 10-day period, staff was forced to use pen and paper until the hospital paid the criminals a $17,000 ransom for the decryption key needed to unlock their computers. Some medical devices were reportedly offline, wait times increased at the emergency room, and some patients were directed to other hospitals. The attack surface is always shifting, and the enormous growth of connected devices, commonly referred to as the Internet of Things, or IoT, will bring with it a new generation of attacks. Last summer, the remote compromise of a Jeep automobile by a pair of security researchers received a great deal of attention. Receiving less attention, but equally concerning, are several alerts about vulnerabilities in drug infusion pumps that the Department of Homeland Security issued over the past year. If a device is running software and it's connected to the internet, vulnerabilities can enable attackers to take control. Attack methods are always evolving and improving. The most common attack method, spear phishing, uses customized targeted emails containing malware or malicious links. Social media is an increasingly valuable tool for attackers as people tend to trust links and postings that appear to come from a friend's social media feed. We have also seen the rapid growth of targeted web-based attacks known as watering hole attacks. These techniques, while originally used only by sophisticated and well-resourced attackers, are now available as toolkits that any criminal can purchase and use. Attacks are getting more sophisticated, but so too are security tools. Most attacks, including recent high-profile breaches, could have been prevented if organizations implemented the latest cybersecurity technology and best practices. To block advanced threats and zero-day attacks, intelligent machine learning and advanced exploit prevention technologies are necessary. These tools use automation to train a system to identify an attack, even one that has never been seen before. It's also increasingly critical to use big data analytics to evaluate global software patterns. At Symantec, these analytics are able to identify and block entirely new attacks purely by evaluating relationships with other devices and other files across a global network of hundreds of millions of computers. Cooperation is also key to improving cybersecurity, and we participate in numerous industry consortia and public-private partnerships to combat cybercrime. These include the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, or NCFTA, the FBI, Europol, Interpol, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Ameripol. We have also been involved in numerous operations to take down criminal networks, including the operations that took down the ransomware network CryptoLocker, the Drydex financial fraud botnet, and the Ramnet botnet. And just yesterday, Symantec participated in a collaborative cross-industry operation that targeted an aggressive threat group known as Lazarus. This is the same group thought to be behind the Sony attack. The initiative, called Operation Blockbuster, significantly bolstered defenses against the cyber espionage group and its disruptive campaigns. Cooperation within the security industry is important, and in 2014, Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, and Intel Security formed the Cyber Threat Alliance to better distribute detailed information about advanced attacks. CTA shares high-value, actionable threat intelligence while still maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of all customer data. The partnership works because it is not about one vendor trying to gain advantage. We are all contributing and sharing with the community to better uncover, understand, and protect against advanced attacks. The cyber threat landscape is always evolving, but so too are new security technologies. Preventing cybercrime is a shared effort, and your work to inform the public is an important part of that. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Bromwich. Chair now recognizes Dr. Porch for his opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to this important discussion on cyberspace and cybersecurity. Let me start. Since the creation of the Internet's predecessor, the ARPANET, kaleidoscopic change has been the single constant in the information environment. What started out as a relatively wonky communications tool for a small group of scientists and engineers is now a global information infrastructure. Information and communications technology changes rapidly, and it is difficult for even nimble corporations to keep up with modifications, to stop the next threat, or to close the next discovered vulnerability. The challenge for the U.S. government in cyberspace is even greater. First, I discussed two trends that are driving this challenge. The first trend is that cyberspace, which is expanding every day as more and more devices are brought online, is becoming increasingly vulnerable as cybersecurity resources are stretched thin. We're straining to keep pace with the increasing complexity as new devices come to the market and become interconnected. Meanwhile, cyberspace is hosting increasingly vast amounts of data. In metaphoric terms, cyberspace is like a balloon. It's constantly being filled with air, and constantly trying to prick the balloon are considerable numbers of people and organizations, terrorists, nation states. This is the second trend, and to continue with the metaphor, pins are like a dime a dozen. To deal with this, we need cybersecurity professionals working on building a tougher skin for the balloon, taking pins off the market, tracking down and stopping would-be pin prickers. But aside from hiring more professionals, what are the options for improving cybersecurity? In earlier RAND work that I published, we identified two needs. The first, enable substantially better information sharing and collaboration among key departments and agencies in the private sector. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 was needed, but small and careful step towards this goal. So why is sharing discovered vulnerabilities, defensive measures, and best practices so important? Because bad actors benefit from slow identification and slow mitigation of the threat. Given the time taken to identify a malicious intrusion and determine its extent, which is usually measured in months, the bad actors are long gone along with your data. If government entities and the private sector are sharing information quickly and often, they have a better chance of being able to anticipate and prepare for the eventual attack. And also, we have to go beyond just identifying and responding to attacks more quickly. Threats have to be anticipated. The behavior of threat actors has to be identified. Intelligence on threat actors and their intentions is a necessary ingredient to significantly improve the chances of predicting and identifying the next attack. A challenge for achieving this kind of information sharing is cooperation, and much of the public is simply not comfortable with the idea of mass government surveillance. Specific attitudes towards this issue are nuanced and complex, but the Pew Research Center reported 65% of U.S. adults believe that there are not adequate limits on the internet data that the government collects. Frankly, even the most well-meaning proposals to increase information sharing between the government and the private sector come across to some as something out of Orwell's 1984. Public debate and discussion of how to balance the needs of security and privacy is a critical step. Information sharing is one perpetual need. A second is to achieve unity of effort across the U.S. government, where different agencies and different organizations have different cyber responsibilities. Cyber defense requires a coherent response, and the bureaucratic swim lanes don't always contribute to synergy for that goal. Ultimately, perhaps ideally, what is needed is the ability to track cyber intruders, criminals, and other hostile actors with the same freedom of maneuver and speed that these adversaries enjoy in cyberspace today. And achieving this goal will require sustained, long-term efforts to develop policy and technology. At present, many ideas for using technology to improve cybersecurity, such as pooling and mining vast stores of data, alarm all of us who believe in a right to privacy from government intrusion. And perhaps new authorities will be required to make this happen. There also needs to be appreciation that everyone has a role to play in improving cybersecurity: the U.S. government, developers and purveyors of internet-connected software and hardware, and individual consumers.
In conclusion, there's no simple solution to the threat posed by adversaries in cyberspace, but one critical challenge that must be overcome is to determine how to protect the cybersecurity of a democratic society that demands both freedom and privacy in its use of computer systems and networks from the threats posed by enemies who respect no boundaries, who can act largely with impunity, and despite national and international norms and legal frameworks. The ideas for commissions to discuss security and privacy are forward-thinking proposals being put forth both by Congress and by the President, and I look forward to learning more about the details of these efforts. Regarding current events, it's fair to say that today's debate about whether device makers should be required to build backdoors into operating systems so law enforcement can collect data has jump-started this much-needed discussion. And this kind of public debate is a good thing. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Porch. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to ask a couple of questions I would like each of you to respond to. So maybe we could start with Mr. Salufo, please. I'm constantly doing town hall meetings and meet with businesses and even individuals, and I am amazed at the number of people and corporations that really do not understand what can happen to their personal computers, to their business operations, and so forth. So we need to somehow ramp up the ability to educate the public. How do we do that?
Congressman Marino, that is an excellent question, and I think it's one we're all struggling with here. But unfortunately, I think there are enough recent incidents where shame on us if we keep hitting that snooze button, whether it's the Hollywood Presbyterian example. This is an example where you had individuals' medical records locked up, and it actually had actual operational effect on the OR and the emergency room of the hospital. It had real impact. The cyber attack in the Ukraine on the grid, this actually, people didn't have power. So these are no longer zeros and ones that are invisible to average citizens, but we're starting to see that cyber attacks affect not only the cyber domain, but the physical domain and the physical world. That said, right now, intellectual property theft is probably the most rampant concern that we all have, and businesses realize that. Unfortunately, in your own state, some realized that when it was too late.
Okay, Ms. Coldy, how do we educate people?
Thank you. I think that the education needs to occur across all levels of education in terms of cyber education, as well as all levels of the business organizational infrastructure. I think we need greater awareness among individual computer users of the risks of online operations, doing your banking online and so forth, and what you can do to protect yourself and your identity and your financial assets. From the corporate or the organizational standpoint, there needs to be additional level education at the business level, the management level, of the risks to business. Cyber is one additional risk that any corporation faces and should be taken into account along with other operational risks that a business must deal with. In addition, we need better education across technical personnel, those who are charged with managing information systems and securing networks, as to both best practices and the potential risks that can occur to that organization and ways to defend against them.
Okay, I'm going to switch now because I only have a couple of minutes. But wouldn't it be a good idea for every laptop, phone, desktop computer that's put out there that the industry can agree on some type of short learning introduction on that computer before you start doing anything that someone has to read and pay attention to? Just a thought.
Yeah, I think I was going to answer kind of that question, actually, which is I think there's been a big focus on on attacks in the news. And I think the public understands the attacks, but they don't understand at all the technologies that they need to have, like multi-factor authentication. These technologies are actually fairly simple and straightforward. They can be made easy to adopt. And I think it's a matter of the public understanding, telling the public, communicating to the public how important it is to adopt these technologies. I think we can educate consumers on these attacks more, but ultimately technology has to be there to do the protection for them. I don't think it's enough to ask a consumer to always just be vigilant or change their password frequently. We need to provide them the technologies that make this a seamless process.
All right. Dr. Porch, I want to switch to a question that shoots off this. What is the federal government's ability or lack thereof to address, prevent, and/or curtail a cyber attack on a large scale?
I think the federal government has strengths that affect everyone in this country, and that the federal government has information and resources to gather about what the threats are. One of the themes in my testimony was, or at least I tried to put forth, is get in front of the threat, anticipate what's going to happen. Your success goes up so much higher when you have a better idea of what's coming around the pike as opposed to a simple reaction. And I don't know anybody else who can help with that concept. And also, as came out in the CISA 2015 bill, sort of a clearinghouse that DHS can play in gathering all the information that can be spread out. I mean, no one has the power to gather the information more than the federal government, and no one is in a position to have to protect it more carefully because of the power of the federal government. So it's a good balancing act. But the resources of the federal government to gather information are incredible.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the subcommittee, Mr. Richmond, for his questions.
Thank you, and I'll address it to Dr. Porch, and if any other members want to comment on it, that's fine. And Dr. Porch, you know that my district probably, in terms of critical infrastructure, we have 3 major seaports. We have probably the largest petrochemical footprint of any district in the country. We have major cross-country pipelines, and then we have major interstate and rail, and with all different owners and players that control each. So I guess the question is, what are some of the unique cybersecurity challenges that critical infrastructure owners and operators face, and are there any particular emergent cyber threats that are unique to critical infrastructure?
Yes, sir, thank you. And growing up in Baton Rouge, down the street from the Exxon refinery plant, and I'm intimately aware of the critical infrastructure and what can happen there. There's some unique things about critical infrastructure. For one, although it's not a popular target for people trying to make a profit, that's good and bad, because the flip side is that the adversaries who are interested in potentially targeting critical infrastructure could potentially be more sophisticated adversaries. So critical infrastructure today might have to deal with a more sophisticated threat than, let's say, a hardware store might have to, although the impact could be same in terms of what could happen. The other issue with critical infrastructure is, there could be vulnerabilities planted or just designed in that exist for years before they're noticed. Critical infrastructure may employ things like programmable logic controllers and older equipment that is not the latest PC, and so now you're dealing with a different way to protect different types of information technology. So awareness of what's going on in that critical infrastructure is vital. Understanding what's normal and what's abnormal is critical. And help, because the critical infrastructure needs to be protected from potentially skillful adversaries who have resources.
Anyone else want to comment, or?
Yeah, I would just say that the protection that critical infrastructure needs is slightly different from what a typical enterprise would need. And so it actually raises the bar for critical infrastructure. They have to be a lot more educated and knowledgeable about the technology. And today, they're taking common Windows computers and using them for really important tasks, when they could be really narrowing down the technology they use and reducing the attack surface. And so that's an important consideration for critical infrastructure.
Mr. Richmond, a couple of other quick thoughts. I mean, industrial control systems, which are agnostic to a particular critical infrastructure, this is an area where you're seeing a major spike in activity. The good news is that the energy sector writ large and the electric sector in particular is doing some good work with their information sharing and analysis centers, but they're not as far along as, say, the financial services sector is, where you have the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the FSISAC, where they're actually sharing information in real time to do patches and the like through tools that are referred to as STIX and TAXI that the Department of Homeland Security and others have made available to the private sector. So I do think that the good news is they recognize, obviously, the implications and the impact The bad news is the threat vector is expanding, the attack surface is growing, and quite honestly, the greatest solution in my eyes will be to bake security into the design of the infrastructures itself. So the more you can think about this on the front end, rather than Lego and attaching security on the back end, would be money and time well spent.
And you mentioned that they're not where the financial services sector is in terms of information sharing, collaboration, and all of that. What do you think we need to do to get them there? Do you think we have to do it through legislation, incentives, you know, stick or carrot? I mean, what do you think?
I'm always for carrots before sticks, so I do think there are some innovative approaches we can examine in terms of tax incentives and other means and the like. I know that's a very difficult and politically charged set of issues, but I don't think the regulatory checked the box. That's looking through rear-view mirrors. It's looking at what we saw yesterday. The reality is the bad guys are thinking ahead. And they're learning from our mistakes. They're learning from their own mistakes, their own dry runs. They're consistently learning and adapting their tactics and techniques. So I do think the reason the financial services sector stepped up is the old Willie Sutton principle. Why rob banks? That's where the money is. They're getting hit. They feel it. It hits their bottom line. It impacts confidence and trust. Clearly, I think with the energy sector, and when you're looking at the potential implications from a public safety standpoint, that ought to also be at the top of the list. But I think first we want to see them come together as an organization. And like I said, there has been some real momentum. I don't want to take away from that, but not as far along as the financial services sector.
Thank you. Now you're back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now welcomes and recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that my statement be put into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And thank you. I apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I find this topic fascinating. I agree, Frank, that we have to be in front of this, not trying to catch up to it. I looked at the OPM breach and the fact that the Chinese were in our systems for somewhere 14 months to 2 years before we detected that. The fact that, according to your testimony, that Russia and Chinese actors have probably already penetrated our grid systems, that they may be actually sitting in the systems, at a point where they could turn it off. I think the legislation we pass is helpful with information sharing, malicious codes. It will be interesting. It's a bit of an experiment to see how well it works. I just met with the CIO of JP Morgan about their efforts in the financial sector and also being able to share private to private with liability protection. But I think that's something that the Congress can do. Obviously, we have oversight, but I'm interested in really what kind of technologies do we see on the horizon? And this is maybe where FireEye comes in. I got a briefing from FireEye yesterday and eyesight in terms of being able to see these threats before they penetrate, or if they do, be able to detect aberrant behavior within a network to shut down that actor and maybe firewall it off. We know Mr. Snowden did great damage as a systems administrator. We know the OPM breach involved old credentials getting inside the system. So that aberrant behavior is also another threat that I see. But I think, we can pass a lot of laws, but I think, I'm interested to hear what kind of technology, software systems do you see on the horizon?
Thank you. And I think you've pointed out some very good examples where traditionally in the past, much of our security infrastructure has focused on protecting the perimeter and identifying attacks as they come into the network, or signature-based technology that relies on alerting things we already know about. So I think as we move forward and we evolve in terms to better protect our networks, those technologies have to do a couple of things. One is to be able to engage detection after the fact. So once the attackers are already in your network, as they're moving from machine to machine, as they're attempting to escalate their privileges within the environment, How do we deploy technology that can detect that type of activity when it's not necessarily based on a specific signature or a previously known piece of malware? We also have to enable our security defenders, those people who are responsible for monitoring those networks, to better be able to triage the alerts that are occurring in their environment. If you've been a network analyst and you get thousands of alerts a day, how do you decide which of those alerts are the most worthy of your attention and the most important to respond to? So context around alert data to help the responders prioritize is critical. Information sharing as well. Some of what iSight does is to proactively look at the threat landscape. What do we think criminal actors are going to do based on the chatter that we're hearing? What do we think that nation states may attempt? So getting more of that information out to the people who need it to be a bit more predictive would also be extremely helpful.
Yeah, and in our bill that we passed, we have the Defensive Federal Networks Act in there. And so as I look at DHS and their ability to protect the .gov space, that's where I think the private sector really has a lot of the solutions. I mean, Frank, do you have any comment on that?
Chairman McCall, I think you raise a number of excellent points, and clearly the ability to repel bad actors when they're in your system has to be part of that solution set. But let me throw another idea out on the table, and I don't know if this is the right time and place, but we have seen major improvements in terms of information sharing. Kudos to all of you on the dais for moving legislation as well. The reality, though, is we've got to get beyond static information sharing. What I think we need to get to is where the private sector can drive intelligence requirements that the government can help then glean and collect against. So you're never going to get that family jewels, that secret sauce document. What you need to be able to do is the private sector needs to be able to levy what their specific requirements and needs are, and then those that have collection capabilities to be able to meet those needs. I think that's the next level of discussion that we can translate some of the good work in terms of legislation into action.
Yeah, I appreciate that. See, my time has expired.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes
Mr. Chairman, I would like ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two letters of comments and also the ranking member's opening statement.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank the chair very much, and to the ranking member of the subcommittee, and then, of course, the full committee chairs and ranking member. Let me speak quickly. Some bells have started to ring. I want to just join and say that I think our committee made a very important bipartisan step when we passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. And I take note of the bipartisan work of this committee on these issues, even though I think more than a decade ago we began to see the unraveling of the issue of cybersecurity and the sort of importance of going head-on in the private sector with 80+% of the cyber world versus the federal government. I think all of us were lagging in the response. So even though we've made some steps in the Judiciary Committee, for example, today we were discussing the interests of international law enforcement trying to get stored data in many of our providers. So everywhere there are questions of either breaching because someone wants the information or breaching when someone should not be getting the information. Let me cite a very quick example on this issue of ransomware. The latest victim, Hollywood Presbyterian, 9,420 beds, and which was forced to pay 4 Bitcoms online, $17,000, to get access to their own patient and administrative computer networks. Police departments have fallen victim. So let me ask the question, does anyone know how often ransomware is used to get ransom from victims, and are there requirements to report ransomware attacks, or should there be? Anyone care to comment on that?
We are seeing an increase in the use of ransomware, and where initially it seemed to be a fairly background noise level type of attack used by amateur criminals largely against individuals, we're now seeing it being used against corporations. And both in terms of the ransomware itself, where the data is encrypted, and in terms of other types of extortion. Basically, the criminals are becoming emboldened. If you're an organization, particularly one that may provide critical services or support critical infrastructure, you can't afford to not be operational, whether that's due to ransomware or due to the fact that someone is threatening to wipe data on your computers and destroy your assets. So I think that that trend is going to continue. I'm not aware of any current reporting requirements outside of the current regulatory framework, but I don't think that those attacks are going to slow down anytime soon.
And would it be helpful, first of all, fact-finding and facts are probably part of a cure, may not be the total cure. I think it would be helpful for us to be aware, policymakers, about these attacks. Would you welcome that, at least providing us with that? When I say providing, through the regulatory scheme.
I would prefer to consider the business impact of that as well, but I think that, again, generalizing, the more we know about what's going on, the more we're aware of what specific things we need to defend against and how we need to promote education around those issues.
Maybe anyone else, but Mr. Bromwich, let me ask you, does Symantec recommend or use backdoors in their cybersecurity products?
We most definitely do not, and we most definitely do not recommend the use of backdoors in really any situation. Backdoors compromise security technologies. Backdoors compromise the integrity of encryption technologies. We strongly believe that those should not be compromised.
As I ask this question, I want you to think of a multi-factor identification, meaning two methods are used to be sure the person given community access or who they claim they are. That sort of goes the overall question of the ransomware and others. But let me ask this question that I hope that I can get any of you to jump in. The U.S. critical infrastructure is already dependent on our nation's cyber networks and systems. These sectors are also increasingly interdependent, and the disruption is obviously massive. What are some of the unique cybersecurity challenges, critical infrastructure, and that's across the gamut, the electric grid, et cetera, that I've been looking at owners and operators face? And are there any particularly emerging cyber threats that are unique to the critical infrastructure? I have some articles that I want to submit into the record on the Porch, but can any of you jump in on any of those that you see?
I think one of the things to keep in mind about critical infrastructure is there's been a lot of concern and very relevant concern about critical infrastructure being subjected to highly sophisticated targeted attacks. And that is definitely a concern. Those attacks would primarily come from very well-resourced threat actors, most likely nation states. But I think it's important to keep in mind that critical infrastructure can be impacted by other types of attacks as well. There may be threat groups that are interested in doing something opportunistic, where they don't care specifically if it's a port, a specific dam, a particular power plant that's affected, but they want to make a very public statement that they can do this sort of thing. So any particular part of critical infrastructure that may happen to be vulnerable may be a target to simply something like a destructive attack. Like any other organization, those types of critical infrastructure organizations are also potentially subject to damaging attacks that are simply incidental. The wrong virus, the wrong piece of malware that gets into the network and shuts down computers without necessarily impacting control systems or infrastructure itself could still put that utility, that financial system out of business until they recover. So it's important to keep aware of the whole spectrum of threats that are potentially impacting those organizations.
Mr. Chairman, may I submit, I saw Dr. Porch, but maybe you can answer in writing. Looked like you were on the verge, but in any event, let me ask unanimous consent to put into the record 9 major models of internet-connected baby monitors are extremely vulnerable to hacking. As I looked at Mr. Richmond, he may have an interest in this. I know I have 2 twin 8-month-olds, and they are, as they say, using new technology. So I ask unanimous consent to submit that into the record. It makes the hearing very important, Mr. Chairman. And then finally, what if cybersecurity, this article, I'm sorry, Consumer Affairs dated 9/3/2015, and then what if a cybersecurity attack shut down our ports October 7th, 2015, and this is not stopping cargo ships, but actually causing the loss of knowing where products are, like clothes, electronics, food, and everything. I ask unanimous consent to put that into the record. Thank you.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next set of bells, you're going to see all of us run. So let me speak quickly. This Congress passed a remarkable piece of legislation recently in cybersecurity and the sharing of information. What should we be looking to do now in the current year, in 2016? Is there anything in particular that we should be doing now? I mean, the sharing of information was an issue. We kind of resolved part of that. What should we be looking at now as a legislative body to help you? Anyone?
I'll chime in first.
Thank you, Doc.
So, one, you may not like this answer, sir, but a little bit of wait. Let's see how well CISA works, you know, if the protections in place are valid, if the voluntary nature of the bill is still successful, people are chiming in. So let's see how successful that is and if there need to be any changes. Maybe far into the future, when we can sort of work out the privacy and the civil liberties issues that will likely come up, start thinking about how do we take advantage of this information? How do we fuse all the different sources and all the contextual information that Ms. Coldy talked about to give us a better picture? So we've kind of, the CISA 2015 bill got us into the information age, despite the fact we've been in the information age for a while. What's next is the knowledge age, where we can actually pull smarts, pull intelligent fusion, pull sense-making out of all that data that we have coming in, doing something quite useful with the data that's collected that can give us insights into the next attack. That's in the future, but we should be thinking about, you know, discussing how do we get there.
Mr. Donovan, a couple of quick thoughts. One, and I touched on in my prepared remarks and maybe in the oral, to examine the active defense set of issues in terms of there's a lot of policy space between build higher walls and bigger moats and hack back. And between that space, we've got to start identifying what some of the actions and steps companies can take to more proactively defend their systems. They can't afford to wait. If government's not going to respond, someone needs to be able to respond. So looking at what those particular rules of the road are, taking a close examination of the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, I think, needs to be part of that. And then the bigger thing, and this may be more of a political question, but the reality is we've got to articulate a deterrent strategy. Right now, our adversaries are operating with impunity. Until we can raise the bar, raise the cost for their behavior, induce changes in that behavior, we're going to be playing defense the whole time. And you know what? I don't care what, and we've got the best companies in the world here, but we're never going to be able to firewall our way out of this problem. We're going to have to be able to lean forward, and that's going to include some policy decisions and integrate that into our overall national security planning process.
From a practical standpoint, again, looking specifically to things that we can do to better defend and educate, I think the information exchange is a really good step forward. I think we should start looking ahead, not only to see how that's going to play out in practice, but what can we do to exchange richer types of information, not just context around the indicators themselves, but countermeasures and recommendations for how to respond. In addition, continuing to look for creative defensive measures, technological as well as best practices from individuals that we can continue to promulgate out in the private and public sector for how networks can better defend themselves.
I would also jump on that and say that there's more work to be done on the sharing front. I think we're doing a good job increasing the sharing that's happening in industry. We'd like it to be more of a two-way street with government. That would definitely be much more helpful. And then finally, just more, a lot more education and emphasis on the technologies that are out there, that are available, to encourage their adoption, to build awareness. There still just is not nearly enough awareness of the technologies that are available and how important the problem is.
Many of you hit on this, and the chairman and many of my colleagues spoke about anticipation of the new type of attacks. I kind of equate this, because I'm a layman, that is this like a disease? We wait for the disease to happen, then we find a cure. Do we wait for attacks, because I suspect there's different ways that people attack our systems, and then try to figure out how to deal with it, or do we anticipate what is the next method of attack and try to protect ourselves from that before it happens?
We definitely anticipate. I mean, everything that we do is entirely focused on being proactive and ahead of the threat. And unfortunately, for many individuals and enterprises and government, it tends to be very reactive. They don't put the protection in place until they are hit. those protections are there. They're designed to be proactive. We're constantly watching what's happening in the threat landscape to understand where we need to go with the technology so that we can get ahead of the attacker.
That's comforting.
I think a lot of the good anticipation comes out of the security research community itself. In my career in IT, everything's theoretical until it's not. So if you see some of the briefings coming out of the private sector or the commercial world at conferences like Black Hat, people who are researching interesting new techniques, new ways to exploit devices, new vulnerabilities that may show up on the horizon, those start out as research and they become reality. During the past year, we've seen an increasing number of attacks against network infrastructure devices, people going after routers. Those types of attacks were discussed at Black Hat as far back as 2007, where it was part of the research community where we're now seeing them in the wild.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to focus on some nation-state concerns, and I'm going to start with you, Ms. Coldy, because some of the trends and developments have started in Russia, and you talked about that in your testimony a little bit. So I really have a two-part question. First part is it concerning to you that Russia and/or Russian actors seem less concerned about being attributed? And then the second part of my question is based on James Clapper's testimony in the establishment of a Russian cyber command. What do you think the implications are of this? Is it a game changer for Russia? What is FireEye seeing in terms of threat reporting in connection with that, if anything?
I can speak most directly to the first part of your question in terms of what we're actually seeing. And historically, Russia has operated in a very stealthy manner. They were always assumed to be very skilled at what they did, but we typically did not see them operating. What's changed over the past few years is that we've had more visibility into their activity. There's been much more public reporting of what they're doing, and despite that public reporting, we do not see them changing their tactics. So they're being talked about in the press, in the media, in the security community, and they're continuing to operate. We've also gotten to see some actors that we suspect very strongly are Russian nation state through some of our incident response engagements, and they've been extremely aggressive within victim environments. Some threat groups, when they're detected, will go silent or they'll abandon the network so that they just disappear once you know that they're there. We've had engagements where we've been working with Russian threat groups where they fight very strongly to stay within that network, and they do so with a great deal of skill and adaptability that challenged even our responders to keep ahead of them. So they're very determined and they're very well resourced. And again, I don't see that changing operationally unless something specific would cause them to do that. In terms of Russia establishing a cyber command, that speaks more to policy, which is not my strong suit, but I think it just shows that nation states in general are going to continue to see the cyber realm as a realm of engagement, similar to any other military, economic, political forum, and that's going to continue. They've clearly stated their intent to keep playing in that world, and they have the skill and resources to be a very powerful player.
Thank you. Let me shift to Iran and something, Mr. Salufo, based on your research. As we all know, the administration announced a nuclear agreement with Iran and lifted a number of sanctions. Can you give me your thoughts on whether or not Iran may move beyond the denial of service attacks into more destructive malware attacks against our critical infrastructure as a result of that Iranian nuclear deal that I referenced in my opening and the influx of cash?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that is the $64,000 question, because I do think there are some legitimate concerns and considerations in terms of not only do they have additional cash to be able to devote to building out their computer network attack capabilities, but they had shown that they were willing to turn to those tools for quite some time now. Historically, Iran was home to one of the most sophisticated hacking underground communities. The Ashiana network and many others have been in business for an awful long time. During the so-called Green Revolution, the way they were able to turn to basically shut down access to anyone inside Iran to the rest of the world was a clear indicator that they have some of those capabilities. I think most importantly, though, is that they are willing to work with proxies. And clearly, when you look at the energy sector in particular, this is an area I think we need to be very concerned about. Let me just underscore one point, and it gets to the question on Russia as well. When we think of cyber, we can't treat it in isolation of the overall strategies and objectives that these nations may have. So the Russian computer network attack and cyber command capability is an extension of what they've been engaging militarily, diplomatically, and through other means for quite some time. And to them, it's about psychological operation. It's perception management, first and foremost. It's computer network attack, secondly. Same goes with Iran. The big question is whether or not cyber is off the table. Is it off the table? And I think we need to make explicitly clear that it better be.
My last question, thank you. My last question, and I'm going to try and give all of you a chance to answer it, relates to something I said in my opening about the fact that despite the increasing magnitude and number of cyber attacks that we're seeing, we've seen, in my opinion, a little response or a clear deterrent strategy from this administration. Now, if you agree with that opinion, you may or may not, but if you do, what actions should the U.S. take, in your opinion, to clearly articulate that there are serious consequences for those types of actions? I'll go down the row. Start with you, Mr. Slufo.
I've been pretty vocal on this, so I do feel that we have not articulated and certainly haven't demonstrated a cyber deterrence strategy. And while I think there's been recognition that we need to be moving in that direction, and I think Secretary Carter, Ash Carter at the Department of Defense has glommed onto this issue as a priority, I think is important. But what is the litmus test? Is OPM, the OPM hack, would that have been a litmus test to be able to demonstrate a commensurate sort of response? Or I think we've had enough of those litmus tests. So the question is if we articulate it, we better be willing to signal and respond. So assuming that we do get our arms around this, we better have the political wherewithal then to be able to respond. And not only through cyber means. At the end of the day, cyber is, it's its own domain, but it transcends air, land, sea, space. So the question is where do we have the greatest strength, and when are we willing to utilize these tools?
I realize, Ms. Coldy and Mr. Bromwich, you may or may not want to weigh in on that question, but feel free to.
I think the one step that's needed is obviously a clear articulation of our policy, and I won't personally speak to what that policy should or should not be, but we need to be clear about what that policy is and what we may or may not do in response. One thing I would like to point out with respect to that is that regardless of the consequences, if we're going to implement some form of consequences, we need to be sure we're implementing it against the right nation state, the right criminal group, and the challenge there is in attributing an attack and in being highly confident fairly quickly who's actually responsible, and that's a big challenge currently.
I agree.
Yes, I would agree. The attribution is super difficult. I think the only thing that I would say is that more discussion and more diplomatic outreach so that we can better find and prosecute criminals would be certainly helpful. Today, many of these criminals operate outside of the realm of law.
Dr. Porch, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. So I would say, and this has been said by panelists here, just remembering that cyberspace is one domain. The United States military operates in many other domains, and so we've heard press articles talk about potential Iranian hacktivists attacking a U.S. dam. I don't have any information that says it's there, but what prevents nation states from taking action are the fact that they would have to deal with the United States in other domains. And so it always has to include all domains, not just cyber. Our response to a cyber attack may not be in cyber.
I thank you all for being here today. Members of the committee may actually have some additional questions for each of you, and I'd ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be open for 10 days, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you all.